Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for well over a decade. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Joe Lombardo. Joe is co-coordinator of UNAC, United National Anti-War Coalition, and he's a very active and a founding member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. Thanks for joining me today, Joe.
Sure, glad to be here.
Let's start right in talking about UNAC and some of the issues that you're concerned about.
Well, UNAC is a coalition of anti-war and social justice groups from around the country. There's about 150 organizations that are affiliated with UNAC. It was actually started here in Albany at a conference in 2010. It was at a time when the anti-war movement was kind of sinking, and those of us that felt we needed to keep an anti-war movement going in the country came together. We had 800 people at our conference, and we formed UNAC, and we've been going ever since. The UNAC right now is dealing with a lot of issues of war because there's war going on all over, and right now there's a serious threat of an escalating war in Syria, and we don't want to see that happen. We want the U.S. and NATO and their allies and the terrorists out of Syria and let the Syrian people decide on their own future. Additionally, we talk about the wars at home because we find a connection to things like the Black Lives Matter movement and what's happening with the black community. People are being shot down in the streets of the United States, the militarization that is happening of the police, the use of military vehicles in our streets, carrying of high-powered weapons in some of our communities. But there's other attacks also right now. We see out in North Dakota, we see the Dakota Access Pipeline, which they're trying to make over Indian land, and over 100 tribes have come together to try to stop them, and they're being pretty much brutalized by the police out there. But that's another issue, many other issues, including the attacks on our unions, the attacks, the austerity, and so forth. So we talk about the wars at home and the wars abroad, and we think they're all very much related. It's a topic we could go into at some depth, but we'll leave it there for right now.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about all of those things if we have time. I know that UNAC is one of the few national peace organizations that is really active right now, which is kind of surprising since there are so many wars going on. Why do you think there aren't more national organizations?
Well, there's many reasons. First of all, we don't get the attention that we used to. You could have a demonstration, it could be a large demonstration, and it likely will not be covered by the media. Many of the wars are not covered. For instance, the war in Yemen is never talked about in our own media right here. And the war in Yemen is being conducted by one of our allies who has attacked the country of Yemen. It's being conducted by Saudi Arabia. But all using U.S. weapons. We've given them about $60 billion in weapons to use against the people of Yemen and other countries. They're using military planes, which are U.S. planes, but the logistics are done by the United States. There is U.S. boats, military vessels off the coast that's enforcing a blockade, which is not allowing food or medicine or anything else into Yemen. Hospitals are being bombed. You hear about this in Syria, but you don't hear about it in Yemen because it's a U.S. ally that is doing these things. But there's many other reasons. People have a lot of problems today, probably more than anywhere else. That's why we talk about the war at home, because people are being attacked. Their civil liberties are being attacked. We are all being spied on by our own government. Snowden showed us this, that every single person in this country is having their phones listened to, is having their internet usage monitored by the government. There is austerity. People are not making what they used to make. The next generation does not look like, for the first time in many generations, will not do better than their parents did. There are people who are searching for jobs, who are in great debt, who are losing their homes. There's many, many things. So people's focus, where it's placed, is very diverse at this particular point. One of the jobs of the anti-war movement and all these movements is to draw the connections and work together on these issues, but that's more than a full-time job for most people. So it's going to be a hard row ahead, but it's the important struggle that we have right now, because things are really falling apart. There's war all over the place. Climate change is an issue that could destroy the entire planet, and we just can't let that happen.
Let's just back up for just a couple of minutes. Let's go back to the Vietnam War. You have been an activist since the Vietnam War. You were during the Vietnam War and since then. Do you think that activists had any effect on the outcome of the Vietnam War?
Yes, I think we had a tremendous effect on the outcome of the Vietnam War. I was a staff person for the National Peace Action Coalition, which was one of the two major coalitions that, similar to UNAC, that was organizing against the war back then. We didn't talk so much about the wars at home and the wars abroad. It was a different period, and people's incomes were actually going up, and there were many, many things that were changing for the better. There had been a civil rights movement, a women's rights movement, a gay rights movement, and people were making strides forward. That's not so much anymore. But in the beginning of that war, they said only 8% were against it. They called it the only consensus war in history. Towards the end, it was close to 90% that was against the war in Vietnam, and it affected everybody. It affected every community. It affected the soldiers who come from the communities, and their brothers and sisters and family members and friends were protesting the war, and so they protested too. And there were actually anti-war organizations that were formed within the military that held sometimes demonstrations right on a military base. That happened at least in one case, and we had to fight for the civil liberties of the soldiers to do that. There were anti-war papers on all the bases. There were anti-war coffee houses near all the bases where soldiers interacted with anti-war activists. And the military kind of refused to fight. You know, they would question their orders, and it became a tool for the government that was no longer a good tool. They could not really depend upon the U.S. military, and a lot of that had to do with the anti-war sentiment, and a lot of that had to do with the anti-war movement, and it played a big role. And it's kind of the model that we use now, but things have changed, and we do have to talk about the wars at home. There are other problems that people are fighting, and there are some differences, and we have to understand those differences as well as those similarities.
I was thinking back during the Vietnam War that there were thousands and thousands of young people that came out to protest the wars, but now those young people have massive student debt to pay back, and they're working 2 jobs, and there are far fewer hours in the day for young people to be protesting.
I think that's true. Some of them are protesting and part of the Fight for 15. Some of the young people were part of the Occupy movement because they had such big debts, and they saw this. Some of those young people are the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement right now. I was one of those young people during the Vietnam War. Part of that, I think, was because of the draft, but I don't think that's all of it. I really think that we had a social consciousness back then that was strongly developed, and I think the culture doesn't lend itself as much to people developing that social consciousness these days as it did back then. The movies, the TV stations, all these kinds of things are very, very different. They're mostly heroes going out and destroying on their own things. They talk about torture, which they never used to do in the movies. The whole culture is very, very different. You can make it on your own rather than collectively trying to work together. There's many, many reasons why it's very difficult for young people, besides the number of hours in a day, which is part of it. And it is a challenge for the movement as a whole to involve those young people and help develop that social consciousness and make them help them to be not only activists online, but also activists in the street, because that's where things will eventually change.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter. That is an area where there are a number of young black people that are getting involved. And what's your take on that? How do you think that's changing the face of activism? How?
Well, I mean, one thing is technology has changed. You know, Edward Snowden showed how they use technology against us, but now everybody has a camera on their phone. Everybody has a phone that they carry around in their pocket. They could take videos. So we're really seeing a situation that probably existed always, you know, but it was very simple to say, for a cop to say, well, I felt threatened, and there was no video, you know, and now you're seeing the video of people being shot down when they're laying on the ground, when their hands are up in the air, when they're just been stopped for a tail light, when they're selling a Lucy on the street, you know, a single cigarette, and cops want to harass the people for doing that. You're seeing what happens with Black Lives Matter, where blacks have been harassed over and over again. And as it becomes better known that there's more support outside of the black community, but black community is just enraged. And for some reason, this government, even led by a black president, cannot just say enough. This will not happen anymore. If we see one more black shot down who is unarmed, there will be a federal investigation into all of these things. There will be prosecutions. None of these people get prosecuted.
No.
And so they feel they can do it over and over again. Someone has to say enough. But they haven't said that from the top down. The mayor of Albany, I heard she went to a conference of mayors, and it was addressed by President Obama. And rather than saying this has to stop in the black communities, his solution was we have to have more policing in the black communities. And I don't think that's the solution. That's just more repression, especially these cops that tend to not live in the black communities, because the black communities, many people who live there because they have to. They can't afford to live other places, or there's still discrimination against them or whatever. Anyway, a lot of them don't live there. They don't understand the culture. So, for instance, the black man that was shot down, that was killed with a taser in Albany, Dante Ives, he was killed by cops simply because he was walking on the street. They didn't know who he was. If they lived in that community, everybody knew that man. He was a basketball star at Albany High. He was a character in the community. People knew him. He had a family. He was just walking on the street. They challenged him, and he had been challenged so much that he said, "Leave me alone." And so they tased him, and they tased him again and again until he died. And so there needs to be community control over the police. There needs to be police that live in the communities to police their own communities. There needs to be lots of changes, but just having more cops sent to the communities is not going to help things. It's going to hurt them. I don't know if that was an answer to your question or more, but
well, I think that was good. Let's switch directions here. Let's go to the international scene.
Okay.
What do you think about what's going on in Syria, and what's UNAC's position on that?
Well, Syria is a very serious situation because all the wars that we've been fighting now since 9/11 have all been in small third world countries with very limited military capacity. In Syria right now, if there was a no-fly zone or something like that, we'd be confronting Russia. Russia has a strong military. Russia has nuclear weapons. So it raises the specter of the possibility of a nuclear war, which could destroy this whole country. That's one of the two ways in the whole world, which is one of the two ways the world can be destroyed, through nuclear annihilation or through climate change. Those are the two big threats that we have right now. But basically what happened in Syria is, in the very, very beginning, there was an uprising, like there were in many of the countries in that part of the world, like Tunisia and Egypt and so forth. But I believe the United States learned something from Tunisia and Egypt, and as soon as it started in Syria, the U.S. intervened immediately and started bringing outside forces in there, started arming people, and it became an armed struggle immediately. And now there are tens of thousands, some people say over 100,000 people that have entered Syria, these so-called jihadists, these people on al-Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda, and ISIS that are there. And basically the government of Syria is fighting against them. The United States and NATO have also been in there. But if you look at the weapons that al-Nusra has, the people that supposedly took down the World Trade Center on 9/11, there are allies now there. The U.S.-funded organizations are embedded with them. They all have the same weapons. They're U.S. weapons. The U.S. has not really even done much against ISIS, and U.S. policy in the region is partly responsible for ISIS. We've always supported jihadists from the time in the early days of Afghanistan, where we supported bin Laden and others to try to get rid of Russia, at the time Soviet Union, in Afghanistan. And now we give support to these warlords, these fundamentalist warlords in Afghanistan. We have always used these people as proxy forces, and we did the same in Libya. We helped bring in these proxies. And now these jihadists are trying to overthrow the government of Assad, which the United States wants to see. It wants regime change there. It talks about regime change in many, many countries around the world, that it wants to have governments that are more favorable to the policies of the United States, that will allow the United States to exploit its resources and so forth. And since Russia entered, U.S. has been in that war for 5 years. Russia entered 1 year ago. October 1st was the 1-year anniversary. They started really hitting these jihadists, which the U.S. hadn't done. And so the tide has turned now, and they're about to take Aleppo, which was their stronghold. Aleppo is divided. You don't hear much about the fact that Aleppo is divided. The side that's controlled by the jihadist has 200,000 people in it. The side that's controlled by the government has 1.5 million people in it. And the reason is people have left the jihadist area and gone into government areas in Aleppo and throughout the country. The majority of refugees in Syria are not going to Europe. They're internal refugees. They've been fleeing the areas controlled by these jihadists, and they've been going to the government areas. And yet the U.S. still wants to overthrow this government, which has been the best fighter against these jihadists. So I think the United States and NATO and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar and al-Nusra and ISIS have to leave Syria, and they have to leave the fate of Syria up to the Syrian people. And that's not the case right now. So we are now, UNAC is with the U.S. Peace Council, with Veterans for Peace, and with others groups, are forming a national coalition to start a national campaign to get U.S., NATO, and their allies out of Syria, so the Syrian people can decide on their own fate. There's a lot of propaganda that's going on right now in the United States, because when the United States goes to war, they always vilify the other countries. And people fall for this. Even people on the left and people in the anti-war movement fall for it, and I don't know why, because they've seen it over and over again. But the United States has troops in over 130 countries. They have 20 times the number of foreign military bases as all other countries in the world combined. They all have to come home. That vast amount of money that goes to support these foreign troops and the intervention in these other countries has to come back here so people can get good jobs and rebuild the infrastructure, change our energy structure over to one that's not based upon fossil fuels. We need to get out of that country, and that's the only way there's going to be peace in Syria.
We're down to less than 10 minutes here. Do you think that the U.S. foreign policy really is moving towards a world war, a war with Russia?
Well, besides what we see in Syria, they've been really building up NATO. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, we made a deal with the Soviet Union that we would not try to move NATO into the Eastern European bloc countries, which used to be called the Warsaw Pact countries, which was a coalition that opposed NATO, or into the former Soviet states. We almost immediately violated that agreement. And NATO has been now grown to, I think it's 28 countries. It used to be 12. It includes about a dozen countries that we said we would not move into. The last NATO conference took place in Poland, which is one of those countries. And one of the things they did there, they brought in 4 new brigades, and NATO and United States has the entire Russian border on the east side, on the west side of Russia, east side of Europe, filled with troops and weapons. They're building what they call a missile shield, supposedly as a defensive move, but it's right on the border. Could you imagine Russia building bases and missiles on the border of the United States? Would not we feel threatened?
Yes.
Well, they feel very threatened. And because of the deterioration of what's going on in Syria, they've actually been mobilizing their military. They've been U.S. and Russia are breaking deals that we've had before against nuclear proliferation and things like this. And it's a very, very dangerous time. And the peace movement has a role to play. We have to point this out. We have to get the aggression of the United States and NATO to back down from that. We have to start talking to people rather than shooting at people, and we have to really build a movement for peace.
So NATO started in 1948 with 12 countries. Now it's up to, I think you said 28.
Something like that, yeah.
And in the beginning, it was formed as an alliance against Russia, right?
Against the Soviet Union.
Against the Soviet Union. What do you think its function is now? And do you think it's counterproductive to peace?
It's very counterproductive to peace. You would think after the Soviet Union dissolved that there would be no more purpose for NATO, but instead of going down, it has grown. And it's even being used now in places like Afghanistan. NATO has been used. It's being used in Africa. It's being used in other places. The U.S. is pushing for all the NATO countries to up their military budget, to raise their military budgets. It's really becoming a force for war in this world, and that's not something we need. It does benefit the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower, warned us against. They make tremendous amount of money of selling weapons all over the world and from wars all over the world and wars that we are involved in. And I believe without the military-industrial complex, this economy in the United States would be would not be able to be maintained, to tell you the truth. If the soldiers came home, they wouldn't have jobs. If we released the people from the jails with mass incarceration, they wouldn't have jobs. So what would we do? It's almost like we need these wars, and we need these wars on the black communities and mass incarceration to keep the system going. And if that's true, then we need to change the system. And NATO is a force for war. NATO needs to be ended. We need to figure out ways to have forces for peace, to build up countries that are hurting rather than to militarize them and give them more weapons and cause more war.
So with the coming presidential election in the U.S., is your position that the peace movement will have to be out in the streets no matter who wins? How do you see the future for the peace movement?
Well, I think we have to be out in the streets now and then. I do not see any hope in either of the two major candidates. Both are really hawkish, are pro-war. Clinton has talked about a no-fly zone in Syria, which is very dangerous, and Trump has talked about using nuclear weapons. Neither of these people are going to bring about peace. So the movement is going to have renewed importance. But I believe without having a black president, I believe, and the fact that both of these candidates are very, very much disliked, I really believe that we can rebuild the anti-war movement in a big way and start being out in the streets again in big numbers and start building a movement that can stay the hand of these people as we did during the Vietnam period. And that's going to be our goal.
Okay. We're down to about 4 minutes. Maybe we could just talk briefly about Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. How do you think Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace has changed this community?
Oh, I think it's changed the community a lot. When I first came here, I live in Bethlehem. I've lived here for about 28 years. When I first came here, it was considered a conservative town. You know, the Republicans were always elected. Right. Now Republicans can't get elected. I don't think we did that all, but I think we were part of a process that led to that kind of change. Things like this show that we do, things like the forums that we do at this library once a month, the vigils that we do has a presence in this town, and I think we played a big role. Besides that, we played a huge role in forming UNAC. We were kind of like the local group that did this, along with others throughout the Capital District, and that has a big role nationally. So Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace has a reach far beyond this community and has been an example for many groups around the country.
Okay, we're down to about 3 minutes, so let's talk a little bit about what people watching can do. What do you suggest people do? Say they've never been an activist before, but they don't like the way things are going. They're tired of these wars. They see what it's doing to our country and our economy and our young people. What do you suggest people do?
Well, they have to first look for alternative sources of information. They're not going to get it on the regular news media. The internet can be used for that, but also joining organizations such as Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace or UNAC, where there are others who can point to articles and videos and things in an alternative way of looking at the world. And once they have that alternative way, we hope they will become active to join a vigil, for instance, that we have come to one of our forums. Suggest a forum, write some articles, do a blog, become part of the movement, because the people that want war and so forth have everything on their side. They have the two parties, they have the news media, they have the money, they have the military, they have the police, they have the courts. But what they don't have is the people, because their policies are against the interest of the people. So it is we, the political movement, that have the possibility of bringing the strength of the people into the political process. And we have tremendous strength. Just by putting our hands in our pockets and stopping cooperating and stopping their working on what they're doing, if we are organized to do such in a collective and a mass way, we can stop all this bad stuff that's going around the world. And so people got to get involved. Mm-hmm. I hope they come and seek us out on Mondays at 5 p.m. at the corner of Delaware and
Kenwood.
Kenwood. That's the street I live on. I should know that. Join us, talk to us, come to one of our forums, and get involved in activity. You start here locally, and then they can be involved everywhere they can be, to whatever extent they can be.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. It was really great talking with you today about all these topics. I wish we had more time, but we're out of time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Trudy.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us. We'll have more talks similar to what we had today with different activists, both from the community and elsewhere. Please join us in the future. Thank you.